Welcome to the Ancient Artifacts. I'm Doug Powell, and today we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to be taking a tour through my first novel. There are a lot of archaeological techniques and locations and history in it, but I'm very visual. It's always more fun to see, so I thought I would give you a walk through all the things that I was working with in order to write this book. Even though I have a number of books out on Christian apologetics, I had never tried to write any fiction. I wasn't even trying to come up with an idea for writing a novel. But I attended an event in December of 2013 that ended up sparking this idea for the novel. And it was called Discover the Evidence. It was held in Plano, Texas. It was hosted by Josh McDowell, and he had invited an ancient Near East scholar named Dr. Scott Carroll to demonstrate this technique he had developed for deconstructing mummy masks. Now, certain types of mummy masks were made out of something called cartonnage, which is kind of like this early form of paper mache, where discarded papyri was used to create the structure for a mummy mask. So the idea is that because discarded papyri was being used, the discarded papyri would be letters and books and inventories and things like that. If you found a piece of cartonnage from about the right time period and the right part of the world, then you might get lucky and be able to find some important ancient documents, including biblical manuscripts. And so that's how this whole project began. Here are the two mummy masks that were used that day for the demonstration. The one on the left actually appears on the front of my book. There were over 100 apologists and archaeologists and theologians to watch this demonstration. It's actually documented in Josh's book, God Breathed. So Dr. Carroll explained that he had developed this solution that would basically dissolve the glue that was holding all of the papyri together in the structure of the mask. But he had some spray fixative that he put on the front of the mask so he could preserve the actual face of the mask as much as possible. And then he went into a pantry outside of the conference area, and there was a camera placed above this industrial sink, and the solution was in the sink. It kind of looked like dishwashing liquid, and he had a headset microphone so he could explain what he was doing, and he lowered one of the mummy masks into the solution and began working the back of it. And then he lowered the mummy mask into the solution and began working the back of it with his fingers. And a few minutes later, he began pulling out fragments from the solution. And then he would try to identify the characters, what type of language it was, and he would set it aside to dry. And he kept doing this until he got all he could from the mummy masks, and he was able to preserve the face of one of the masks. The other one completely dissolved. So then, after all the fragments that were recovered were dried, they were placed on these tables where the different scholars took a look at them. So here's Dr. Carroll working with a couple of the fragments that had been recovered. And then all the words that could be read on the fragment were entered into an ancient manuscript database in the order in which they could be read. And hopefully there would be some kind of hit with these keywords, and you'd be able to identify what had been recovered. And by the end of the weekend, it turns out there were actually 5 fragments from the New Testament that had been recovered. And they were in the Coptic language, and they were all the oldest Coptic copies of those particular passages ever found. It was pretty amazing. And there were a number of other important books as well. So, of course, I totally geeked out over that whole thing. But I started asking myself, well, what's the craziest thing they could possibly find? What's the most outrageous thing you could expect to plausibly find in such a thing? And I wasn't trying to really find an answer. It was just kind of a fun question to ask. But a couple of years later, I had this answer. Something occurred to me, and that became the basis for the novel. In fact, this whole thing that I just described to you is basically the first scene of the novel. The thing that I thought would be fun to discover actually has to do with this. This is called the Copper Scroll. It was part of the Dead Sea Scroll discoveries. Between the late 40s and the mid 50s, there were 11 caves that were discovered, and the third one had this particular scroll in it. Now, it looks like two, it's actually one scroll. It's 3 sheets of copper that had been riveted together. It's the only scroll that was found on copper. And when they found it, they didn't want to unroll it because it was so oxidized, they thought it would just crumble and fall apart. And altogether, you're looking at about an 8-foot long strip of copper when all of them were together. So about 2.5 years later, they figured what they would do is they would coat it in some kind of adhesive or glue and kind of bake it on there. And then they took a circular saw that was really like a dental tool that had been hot rodded with this super small circular blade, and they started cutting it into strips. They cut the strips off, and they ended up with 23 curved segments, and here's what it looks like today. And when it was found in 1952, that territory on the west side of the Dead Sea was still part of Jordan. So what you're looking at is now housed in the Archeological Museum of Amman in Jordan. When they were finally able to read what was on the scroll, it turns out it's a treasure map. Now, it's not a treasure map like a pirate map or something like that. Instead, it's like a list, almost like an inventory. There's 64 sections, and each one has a hiding place and a command to dig or measure or something like that. There's a group of locations around Mount Zion on the southwestern hill of the Old City near the Essene Gate. There's a group of locations around Qumran, which is where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. There's a group of items closer to Jericho. There's one around Jerusalem in general, and then there's a few random places as well. A lot of times the locations are, you'd never be able to find them. It's like between the 2 tamarisk trees, you'll find this. And there would, of course, be no way of knowing which 2 tamarisk trees, even if they still existed 2,000 years later. But some of them are identifiable places that do still exist, and they've been investigated and nothing's ever been found. But still, it's pretty cool. The treasure that was hidden is probably from the temple itself, the second temple, and it was probably hidden as the Romans approached the city in AD 70 in order to lay siege to it. And so they hid all the temple treasure in these different areas in order to have the funds in order to rebuild it whenever they got the chance. Some Dead Sea scholars believe that this is a legendary treasure and that it shouldn't be taken seriously at all, but most think it's serious, but that it's either been found or just lost or something like that. But you're talking about a huge treasure. There's 4,630 talents of silver and gold, which is more than $1 billion worth at the conservative estimate. And then you've got jewels and coins and gems and things like that. So there's a lot of treasure distributed throughout these 64 different places. Now, in the book, the character gets hired by the Israeli Antiquities Authority, and this is what that building looks like. It's on the northeast corner of the old city, and so you can see the old city wall there. And it opened, that's the Rockefeller Museum, actually, is what it is. And within there is the Israeli Antiquities Authority. If you've never been to Jerusalem, one of the surprising things about it is how close all the things are that are important, that you want to see. You can walk to a lot of these things. You could walk to all of them, probably. So this was a picture I took standing on the Tower of David and looking out over the city toward the Mount of Olives. So that's the mountain in the background. You can see I've got the Holy Sepulchre on the far left. You can see the Rockefeller Museum way over there. The Temple Mount, where the Dome of the Rock is. You've got the Tomb of James next to it. And then down below in the valley there is Hezekiahs Tunnel. Almost all those play into the book. I took a reverse shot from the Mount of Olives. And here again, you got the Rockefeller Museum on the right, Tomb of James down in the Kidron Valley, which is right there between the Mount of Olives and the Temple Mount. And you can see a Holy Sepulchre way in the background, and then the temple pinnacle. The highest point of the temple is that southeast corner there, and then Hezekiahs Tunnel would be a little bit down the valley to the left. Now, these things are important because one of the locations that I used was the tomb of Zadok. Now, Zadok means just, and Jesus's half-brother James was known as James the Just. Now, according to tradition, he was martyred in AD 62 when he was stood up on the southwest corner of the temple and told to recant his faith to the crowds during Passover, or they were going to throw him over the top. And instead of recanting, he preached the gospel, and they threw him off this corner. This is the southeast corner as it looks today from the Temple Mount itself. And if you look through the slat on the left down into the valley, the Kidron Valley, then you'll see a tomb. And from the foot of that corner, you can see the tomb a little bit more clearly. It's the one with the pillars there. You're looking right at the Mount of Olives there, and over to the left is the Garden of Gethsemane. And if you were standing in between those pillars and looking back up, it would look like that. Now, that is where James was traditionally martyred. He was thrown from the top corner. He hit the pavement below. He was still alive, and he got up on his knees and was starting to pray for the people trying to kill him. And one of them took a club, a fuller's club that was used to thicken wool, and hit him in the head until he was martyred. That tradition is recorded in Hezekiahs, which is a 2nd century writing. Here's what it looks like standing in the cave of Zadok, or the Just. Now it's known as the tomb of Bnei Hazer because apparently a family of priests had been buried there. And if you turn around and look deeper into it, you can see there are a number of places to lay bodies on those benches and then put them in ossuaries and slide them into the cokes there, the holes. Now, when we're talking about the recovery of ancient Jerusalem and the beginning of the archaeological exploration for it, it pretty much begins with a guy named Charles Warren. He was a British officer. He's an engineer, and he was recruited by the Palestine Exploration Fund to conduct biblical archaeological reconnaissance with a view of further research and excavation to be undertaken in Ottoman Syria, but more specifically, the Holy Land and biblical Palestine. So he was the one who conducted the first major excavations of Jerusalem's Temple Mount. And that's what ushered in this age of biblical archaeology. And if you read his books about his explorations, they are fascinating. He's a great writer. And they've got all these great drawings of him sinking shafts into the ancient city, the old city, and they're almost like mining shafts, trying to find like the bottom of the wall, the very foundations of the Herodian platform. But he's, it's the 1870s, so he's down there with a candle, looking at these things, investigating these things. It's fascinating. A little bit of Charles Warren trivia. He went back to England and became the chief of police that investigated the Jack the Ripper murders. Actually had to resign over them when they weren't solved. But back in Jerusalem, he was pretty much an archaeological hero. And one of the things that he discovered or recovered was Hezekiahs Tunnel. Now, Hezekiahs Tunnel was discovered actually by Edward Robinson in 1838, but there was no confirmation of it. He pretty much thought that was the place, but it was all filled up with a bunch of trash and rubbish and things like that. And he didn't clear it out. He didn't explore it. And he didn't confirm it. So that was left for Charles Warren to do. Hezekiahs Tunnel, it's almost like this minor side note. You see it in 2 Kings 2:20 and 2 Chronicles 32:30. It says that Hezekiah built a tunnel. So what was going on is that Sennacherib was approaching the city in order to lay siege to it, and Hezekiah knew that in order to survive the siege, they needed water. But the only natural water supply in Jerusalem that wasn't rainwater is this little spring called the Gihon Spring, and it's right outside the old city wall. It's in the city of David. So Hezekiah ordered that a tunnel be built that rerouted the water from the spring into the city walls and into the pool of Siloam. And in order to do it, he had two teams of diggers, and he set one up at the spring and one down the pool of Siloam, and they dug toward each other. That's how they survived the siege. So this, again, is just kind of a minor little note in the Old Testament, but the discovery of it is this confirmation of accurate biblical history. In December 1867, Charles Warren started at the Pool of Siloam and started clearing out the tunnel. And he almost drowned trying to get to the far side of the tunnel, the Gihon Spring. But he made it, and it was identified as the tunnel that Hezekiah had built. And then this was confirmed again in 1880 when a couple of boys who were swimming near the Pool of Siloam went into the tunnel, and they found an inscription in the side of the tunnel and described how the tunnel was built. And then this inscription is now in the Archeological Museum in Istanbul. This diagram shows that there are a number of shafts and channels and pools that are actually a part of this whole Gihon Spring network. There was much more there than Warren recovered. Now you can see kind of the arc from left to the middle of the diagram. That is Warren's shaft system. So that's part of what he found and drilled down into. And then there's this blue vein coming from the left to the right. That is the tunnel that Warren cleared out as he moved from the Pool of Siloam all the way to the Gihon Spring. You can see the Gihon Spring there on the right, and it looks like there are steps leading down to it, which is how people got to the Gihon Spring when Charles Warren first began his investigation. But you couldn't go all the way down it, so he'd cleared it all the way from the south to the north. Since this time, there have been a number of other discoveries, and the main pool, the big pool that you see here, wasn't even discovered until 1997. It's a huge pool. It's like 53 by 32 feet. It's actually 46 feet deep at its deepest. It's so big there was actually a house built inside of it after the pool wasn't used anymore. There's organic material in it that is dated all the way back to 700 BC, and they have found pottery from the early 8th or late 9th century. So this is a very ancient place in here. These days, the way you get down to it is you are at the top of the hill and you go down through the Warren shaft system all the way down to the Gihon Spring. But before this 1997 discovery, the way you would go down into the Gihon Spring was through this little house. And this is more toward the bottom of the hill. So on the other side of that little wall there is a stairwell going down into the Gihon Spring shaft. And then the other end of it, this Pool of Siloam, looks about like that. This is a picture of the Kidron Valley, and this is, you've got the southeast corner of the Temple Mount on the right side of the picture. You've got the foot of the Mount of Olives on the left, and so you're looking straight down this area just to orient you. Now, if you walk down those steps, this is what you would see. Actually, what you would see is on the left. You get to the Gihon Spring itself, the pool of water, and there's this metal grate that you walk across, and then you can walk through the water all the way through Hezekiahs Tunnel to the Pool of Siloam. But there wasn't always this metal grate across the top. So the right side of the picture is what it used to look like when you got to the bottom of the stairs and you just step right into the water. And you can see that below the lowest step, there's a little bit of an opening. And in 2007, a couple of brothers, they were like 14 and 16, they actually swam in the water into that hole, and they had flashlights with them. and they came up in an air pocket and stood up and used the flashlights to shine it around and found they were in a room, this hidden room. And this was actually where the spring comes up, where the water comes up out of the ground. This is where the wall got built by Hezekiah to reroute the water. And it's also probably a ritual bath where a lot of the rabbis would be cleansed before going up to the tunnel to worship. This, of course, is the Western Wall Plaza. This boat ramp looking thing on the right is the ramp that gets you onto the Temple Mount if you're not Muslim. From the other side, it kind of looks like this. It used to be that there was a mound of earth that this was on, but it eroded at one point, and they built this structure as a temporary fix. But every time there was an attempt to make a permanent one, it set off a bunch of controversy between the Jews and the Palestinians. And so the temporary ramp has become permanent. If you go around to the other side of it, you can see the very top of the ramp there in the top left corner of this picture. But down below, there are the ruins of the first century pavement just below the southwest corner of the Temple Mount. You can see how much the street level has changed since the first century there. Now, what you're looking at was thrown from the top of the temple down. These are the remains of the buildings that were on the temple when it was destroyed in AD 70 by the Romans. It's a huge pile of rocks. You can see, look at the guy walking past it. It's a massive amount of stone. Look at the course of stones up toward the top of the right of the picture there. That is the very beginning of an arch that used to go across this part of the pavement. It's called Robinson's Arch, and it used to be one of the major entrances to the temple back in the first century. But back in 1967, 68, when this was being excavated after the Six-Day War, the ground level was much higher. Look at this. They're still digging it out right there. And you can see that part of it actually is at ground level. In fact, when Charles Warren came to town, it looked like that. It was at ground level. That's how much Jerusalem has changed since the time of Jesus. It's been knocked down and rebuilt a number of times. Now, to get a real sense of just how much has changed since the time of Jesus, here's a shot of the Western Wall I took from the entrance ramp to the Temple Mount. Now, the red line that you see there is approximately what the ground level was at the time of the Six-Day War in 1967. And the yellow line there is actually the width of the Temple Mount Plaza at the time of the Six-Day War. That's all they had, because what you're looking at there used to be a neighborhood. Here's what used to be there. This is a shot looking toward the Mount of Olives. You can obviously see the Dome of the Rock there. And all this neighborhood that you're looking at used to be the North African slum, a Moorish population. And the only place for the Jews along this wall was right here. It was very, very narrow. So that here it is at Sabbath. Here it is with just some visitors in it. That's really hard to imagine the Western Wall Plaza looking like that. Again, you're about 15 feet above the current ground level, what you're looking at right here. When Charles Warren moved to town, this is what the southern wall looked like of the temple. It just looked like this green hill. But Charles Warren, before he got there, he had done his research. He knew it was supposed to be there from reading not only the Bible, but other ancient documents and Jewish sources. So he wasn't just like digging these shafts randomly, trying to find things. He had this knowledge of where to dig and what he expected to find when he dug there. When Israel captured East Jerusalem in the Six-Day War, they almost immediately began excavating all of this stuff around the Temple Mount. Archaeologists and Charles Warren knew that one of the main entrances to the Temple Mount was on these stairs that went up to the southern wall. And even before they removed all the dirt, they could still see the bricked in arches at the top of the hill that was covering the steps. So when they took away the dirt on the steps, they could see what led up to the triple gate. And this is part of what's called the Holy Gates. There was another pair called the double gates, and it was over here. What you're looking at right here in the corner is the right half of the right arch. And right up above it, you can see the dome for the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the mosque that's on the Temple Mount currently. It is the third holiest mosque in Islam. And that building originally was the site of the headquarters for the Knights Templar. And it stands on the place where the royal stoa was, the market where Jesus overturned the temples. This was bricked in by the Templars to restrict access to the Temple Mount, and it has never been unbricked. Now, Charles Warren wasn't the only guy that's important in these excavations. There was another guy who showed up a couple years early, and his name was Charles Wilson. He was also a British officer. He was a brigadier general. He was a geologist. He was an early archaeologist. And he was hired, he was sent over to Jerusalem in order to improve the water supply for the city, because people kept traveling over there and getting sick. They still had open sewers and things like that. So he went over there in order to do a survey of the city so that the water supply could be fixed. And while he was there, he did a survey of the Temple Mount in 1864. And a couple years later, Charles Warren was also allowed to do a survey of the Temple Mount. And together, they came up with this map. This remains the most accurate and best survey map of the Temple Mount in existence. And that's because they were actually allowed into the subterranean passages and chambers underneath the Temple Mount. It turns out the Temple Mount has several dozen subterranean areas. Most of them are cisterns. They collect water, they collect rainwater. And nobody had ever explored them really until Charles Warren and Charles Wilson. And that's what makes this map so important and so fascinating, because nobody else has been allowed down there again to make a more comprehensive survey with better equipment, with modern equipment. So this survey map, which was created in the 1870s, is the best map we have of everything that's beneath the Temple Mount. The way they came up with this map was by lowering themselves from the surface of the platform into the well, hanging on a rope with candles. Sometimes they'd get to the very bottom and all they would have is candlelight, and they would draw what they saw as best they could. Sometimes they were hanging from the rope and trying to draw it. Sometimes they dropped a candle into the water and they'd have to draw it by memory. So as accurate as it is, some of it's kind of ballpark. And it turns out that there are conduits that they saw but couldn't explore that seem to connect to other cisterns. Now, you might be wondering why there were so many cisterns up on the Temple Mount in the first place. But you got to remember, they needed water really bad. They had to collect rainwater for all the pilgrims that were visiting for the different temple ceremonies. And there were blood sacrifices happening every single day at the temple. So they needed a lot of water to not only provide for the visitors, but to wash away the blood. I mean, really smelled like a slaughterhouse. There are documents where the Roman soldiers who were housed at the Antonia Fortress on the northwest corner of the Temple Mount complained about the awful smell, because they were killing animals every single day. It literally smelled like a slaughterhouse. So they needed a bunch of water to wash this stuff away, and then it would drain out into the Kidron Valley. And that meant there had to be this network of tunnels and cisterns, and yet they have never been explored. So here is an overlay of the Temple Mount as it exists today. That's the black and white part. The grayer part is the raised platform that has the Dome of the Rock there, and then the red would be a diagram of the second temple, the Herodian temple there. And the Holy of Holies, as you can see, is right over the spot where the Dome of the Rock is. Here's a satellite map with an overlay of where all the cisterns are, and here is just the diagram of where the cisterns are. So there are 36 cisterns. Wilson numbered them, and turns out that some of them are so big they have several different well caps. So if we take an aerial photo here, you can see that I have identified, I've labeled as many of them as I could that were in the shot there. If you zoom in, there are little green spots you can see. Those are the lids that are now permanently closing these well caps. Up close, it looks like this. That's the Al-Aqsa Mosque entrance in the background. And right up close, that's what it looks like. That is the entrance to cistern number 8, one of the 3 entrances, and it's right in front of Al-Aqsa Mosque. And only one image exists of what it looks like inside any of the cisterns, and it happens to be cistern 8. And it was rendered by a war correspondent who was with Warren one of the days that he went down. So you can see that there are a couple of different openings. There's some light toward the back of the cistern there. There's actually a guy descending by rope from the big square you see at the top. And look over on the left side of the wall there. There's this opening. There's a conduit there. And nobody knows where it goes. Nobody knows what it connects to. Charles Warren measured this as 43 feet deep. This is how big it is. So you're talking about a 4-story drop there. There's also a cave directly beneath the Dome of the Rock. And sometimes non-Muslims have been allowed in there to see it. But for the most part, it's reserved as a very exclusive prayer room at this point. But a few years ago, the cave was recarpeted, and somebody who was there actually whipped out their cell phone and took a couple of pictures of this thing being recarpeted and posted them online. So this is what it looks like underneath the Dome of the Rock, and it's got this marble flooring in there these days that's been carpeted over, but beneath it is this marble flooring. And there are 2 places there that are covered in mosaic tile. And it's said that if you bang a staff or something on this mosaic, you can tell that it's hollow. There's a cave below it, and that is called the Well of Souls. And that, according to Muslim tradition, is where the souls of the dead gather each Friday for prayer. There it is with no carpet on it at all. There are 2 other subterranean passages that are fascinating that are not conduits or caves, and they're left over from the Herodian temple. And they happen to be what's on the other side of those bricked-in arches that I showed you at the top of the stairs of the southern wall. So here's a close-up of the survey map made by Warren and Wilson. This dark area right in the middle there is the subterranean passage that goes from the double gates directly under Al-Aqsa Mosque. To the right, you see another long, dark passage, and that leads from the triple gates directly underneath the Temple Mount. And those unusual odd shapes, those are the cistern areas. If we go back to the map where everything's labeled, you can see that at the top of the triple gates, right in front of it, if you follow it, if you go from the top of the stairs where the triple gates are, and then you see cistern 10, then cistern 11, and then there is this shack, this lean-to looking thing. That's where the subterranean passage lets up. So if you were one of the apostles or Jesus, you would have gone up the steps, in through the triple gates, and then through the subterranean stairway up to the surface. That's how you'd get onto the Temple Mount. The same thing over on the left. You'd go up the stairs into the double gates, through the subterranean passage of stairs up to the surface. That lean-to shack-looking thing is the top of the stairway, and it looks like that. It's kind of crazy how ramshackle that thing is. It actually is an entrance to a second mosque now, the Al Marwani Mosque, that is built in that subterranean space right there. So that's where the triple gates come up these days. And there is another kind of subway entrance looking thing that is directly in front of Al Aqsa Mosque. And this is where the subterranean passage from the double gate comes up. And if you go right up to it, it looks like that. And these days, it's a library down there. Now, you can't go down there unless you're Muslim, but there have been Muslim visitors who captured it on video and took pictures and have posted it. And so here's what it looks like when you get down there. They've changed the carpet, so, the pictures will vary a little bit. But when you get to the bottom of the first flight, you're looking at the southern wall, way down there. That's the southern wall where the double gates are walled up. So you walk down this hallway, you get to a landing and come down this other set of stairs. And right here, it's taken from a perspective right inside the double gates. And you can see they've got these pillars, ancient pillars that have been shored up. Those are the original Herodian pillars from these double gates. The Hulda gates is what they're called. And if you look up, you can just barely see part of the domes that are left over the vestibule area, the entrance area. From that little landing there, if you look straight back, that is directly inside the walled up part of the double gates. And you can see those pillars a little bit better from this angle as well. One last part of the book you might wonder about has to do with kind of a side story about a historical figure named Montague Parker. And he explored Hezekiahs Tunnel looking for secret passages that would take him all the way to the Well of Souls directly beneath the Dome of the Rock. He actually did find a couple secret passages in Hezekiahs Tunnel and helped clear it out again because it had started to fill up yet again after Charles Warren had cleared it out. But he couldn't find a way all the way to the Well of Souls, so he got a little bit impatient, and he waited until there was this one particular Islamic festival where a lot of the Muslims would leave town for the day, and he bribed the guards at the Temple Mount to let him into the Dome of the Rock, and he dressed in Arab gear, and he and his team went into that prayer cave directly beneath the Dome of the Rock and started trying to open that covering over the Well of Souls in order to get in there and hopefully find the Ark of the Covenant. But they got busted while they were in the middle of it, and they had to flee for their lives, and they made it all the way back to Tel Aviv and got on this guy's yacht, Montague Parker's yacht, and got out into international waters. But it created this big incident, and this is a newspaper clipping from the New York Times from May 7th, 1911. And in some reports, it claims he actually did find the Ark of the Covenant and took off with it. Others say he found it but couldn't take off with it. And he was this very controversial figure that had caused this international incident that almost nobody knows about now, and it's absolutely fascinating. So those are just a few of the places that you'll visit and some of the things that you'll learn and encounter if you decide to take the ride in the Well of the Soul. And if you choose to, you can find it at Barnes & Noble or Amazon or at Whitefire Publishing.